Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us for our webinar this evening. I'm Miriam Druitt, the Marketing Communications Manager with AHDB Pork, and I'm delighted to bring you this evening's webinar. We also have Lucia Gregson, Knowledge Exchange Officer in the pork team with us, and she's going to help field some questions later on. Over the two webinars that we're running, we'll be focusing on how feed, water, and practical management can help optimise responsible antibiotic use further, while maintaining good animal health and welfare. During the first of two webinars, we'll be hearing from Dr. Charlotte Evans, National Pig Advisor for ForFarmers, and Dr. Mandy Nevel, Senior Veterinary Manager at AHDB. Charlotte is going to be talking to us about feeding for gut health, highlighting some nutritional solutions to optimise antibiotic usage. Mandy will then be talking to us about why recording antibiotic use is important and some of the opportunities and challenges that we'll face over the coming months. It's great to see a mixture of people on the call tonight, so we hope there'll be something for everyone to take away. The plan for the webinar is for Charlotte and Mandy to run through their presentations. This will take 30 to 40 minutes, and there'll be time for some questions at the end of the webinar. Everybody will be muted throughout the webinar, but if you have any questions that you would like to ask, you can type these into the question box on your screen. We will then pose your questions to Charlotte and Mandy at the end of their presentations, and we'll aim to finish up within the hour. We will endeavour to keep the webinar running smoothly, but please bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. If you do experience any issues yourself, you can join the webinar via phone and watch the slides through your screen. So without further delay, I'm delighted to invite Charlotte from ForFarmers to kick things off this evening.
Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this evening. I'm just going to start at my presentation. I'll have to apologise to you all in advance. The reason why I'm not with the rest of everybody at AHDB is I've got a cold, so I'm in isolation at home. So if I have to mute myself just to cough a couple of times, I'll do it swiftly and then come back to you. So if there is a lag, it might just be me doing that in the background. So as Miriam says, I'm the National Pig Advisor for ForFarmers, and the idea of the next 15 to 20 minutes is just to look at what's happening within the feed industry and some feeding management strategies that we can look at to feed to support the gut and really try and overcome the next hurdles that we've all got to achieve as an industry. So firstly, just wanted to give a little bit of background. I suppose within the feed industry, we've seen a real gradual phasing out, I suppose, of in-feed medication. And some of you on the call, of course, will have all been involved with the removal of antibiotics as growth promoters in 2006. And really, we're seeing a continuation of that. So we're all aware of this antimicrobial usage target that we're all aiming at towards 2020. But of course, before that, in 2018, we're seeing copper levels decrease in diets of pigs up to 12 weeks of age. And over the next 5 years, we're also seeing zinc oxide, of course, being removed from diets, which is obviously the main one that people are using to prevent post-weaning diarrhea in piglets post-weaning. The other thing that probably we just need to have on the front of our minds as well is the EU veterinary medicines and medicated feed regs, which have been reviewed. Basically, this means that the revised rules will come into force in 3 years' time. And for us as an industry, it means that in the medicated feed file, potentially antibiotics won't be allowed to be used for prophylactics except in exceptional cases for the treatment of an individual animal, when the risk of development or spread of infectious disease is very high or the consequences of infection are likely to be severe. There's also a possibility that there will be some antibiotics that we're currently using that will be restricted just for human usage. So it's another thing that we perhaps as an industry just need to be aware of that might influence things for us as well. But really, all I wanted to say on that is that, you know, it's not all bad, and certainly, you know, the good news is that as an industry, we've gone through this before, and there's a lot of knowledge out there that we can all help to overcome the next challenges. And this graph shows the outcome of our experience in the Netherlands, who of course have had to remove all in-feed antibiotics. Really the main take-home message from this slide is the growth rate, which you can see in blue here. So over the last 10 years, what we can see is that every time we've had a big reduction in antibiotic usage, we have seen a little bit of a decline, but in generally that growth rate is on a positive trajectory, and there's lots that we can learn from other experience. And you can see here on the y-axis, obviously growth rate's not as good as perhaps we're seeing in the UK. So I'm sure that by pulling together as an industry and all working together, we can make sure that this transition is even more smooth in the UK. Under which circumstances can feed can actually influence pig health? A bit of a caveat, I suppose, before we start going into more of the nutritional interventions. Whilst nutritional intervention is not going to be obviously very helpful when a group of animals is suffering from clinical disease and perhaps not eating or drinking, we know that, of course, if an animal doesn't receive the essential nutrients that it needs, then it's going to be compromised and more likely to suffer from sickness a bit later on. So when we think about the influence of feed, we're looking at making sure that all animals get the level of nutrition that they need, and we're talking more about protecting pig health here as opposed to reducing severity of clinical disease when we see outbreaks. And where we know that feed and feed management is more effective is against your more enteric diseases, your E. coli, salmonella and ileitis. And more of a supportive role here for your streptococcal and your respiratory infections, which of course enter the lungs. And broadly speaking, there's common agreement of an interaction between nutrition and health on these three main areas. So one, supporting the immune system, so that if an animal is challenged, it has some chance of fighting off the infection. Two, reducing that harmful bacteria, so if we get anything in the system, we can promote the good bacteria and reduce the harmful bacteria. And thirdly, providing that physical barrier, if you like, to reduce anything coming into the bloodstream, but also making sure that all of those nutrients coming through the body is absorbed properly as it should be. And what I'll do is just go through the ways in which we can achieve these three main areas through feed and feed management. I think first and foremost, as an industry, we're blessed by the variety in our systems, genetics, and the people involved, of course, in it. And of course, this means that the level of feed intake from farm to farm for any given age of pig is going to vary quite a lot. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in our system, to provide that basic level of nutrition and make sure that the animals are not compromised. I think one of the main things that we could really benefit from is to just take a look at our systems and make sure that the diets that we are feeding are still matching the expected level of feed intake. I think this is especially important given that rate of genetic improvement we have seen. For example, I was on farm a few weeks ago now, and the producer said that he hadn't actually reviewed his feeding regime for 7 years. And when we looked at what had actually happened on the farm over those 7 years, there were huge amounts of changes, management, housing, genotypes, all of which, of course, will impact on the feed intake of the pigs now in his system. So I think that's the one thing that we really need to get on top of. Given everything that's going on in the unit, are we definitely feeding diets at the right time and the right amount to match that expected feed intake? Is that diet still appropriate for those ages of pigs? And are we making sure that we're not holding back feed intake in any way? So, for example, we know that water intake drives feed intake. Have we cleaned the water systems? Are the water systems at the right height for the pigs? Are they at the right flow rate and everything else? And of course, you know, the basics like, is the hygiene of the feeds okay on the farm? Can the pigs access it? And are we as a feed company, you know, doing everything we can to make sure that all the extrusion, all the cooked cereals, everything else is getting to you as it should be in the right state? So firstly, we'll come on to some of these 3 key areas. I put it that way round, but of course, in the body, the gut barrier is often the first line of defence, but in small young animals, that's something that happens a little bit further on down the line. So first of all, it's making sure that we're actually providing the immunity via colostrum to make sure that they can fight off infection and then reduce harmful bacteria, and then the gut barrier comes a little bit later on. And of course, as an industry, one of our challenges has been the prolificacy of our breeding herd. So I don't know about those of you on the call, but you know, over the last 5 years, we're seeing on average an extra 3 pigs weaned a sow per year than we were. And of course, as a result of that, we're seeing an increase in birth weight variability and a drop in average weight of those pigs. And of course, the main source of immunity in these small animals is via colostrum from their mum. So the challenge that we have as an industry is making sure that all of those pigs are getting all of the colostrum that they need and setting them up correctly in case they get infected a little bit later on down the road. And of course, this variation causes us quite a lot of competition at the udder. And this graph is showing that for the lighter born piglets, regardless of the reasons why they are small, take a lot longer to get their first colostrum intake, and overall their chances of survival are much lower. And what we're seeing here in actually all 3 groups is that if farrowing duration is taken more than 4 hours, for example, we're seeing a dramatic fall away on the chance of survival and the time from birth to the first colostrum intake in all animals. And of course, we also know that piglets need about 250 grams of colostrum to provide them with things that they need for immune function. So for some of these small pigs shown here, that can be about a quarter of its overall weight, which is a huge amount when you think about it. And if, of course, if they don't have this, then they'll be more susceptible to illness later on in their lives. So what can we do about this as an industry? So a lot of people within the industry, of course, are giving piglets an oral supplement of energy during the first 12 hours to get those small piglets to the udder. And a lot of people now are practicing split suckling to give a level playing field and to make sure that those small pigs get enough time on the udder without competition from others to make sure that they have a bit more colostrum to set themselves up, which of course are all brilliant things, and all these things should be practiced regularly on a farm level. But of course, outdoors we can't do this unless there's been investment in those outdoor farrowing tents, and it's not always feasible inside to get to that window of opportunity to make sure that those piglets get to the udder at the right time that they need to. And I think there are some ways in which we can help the sow nutritionally so that we can help to provide more of an equal playing field to make sure that those piglets are maximising those chances really on the udder. And I think the first thing that perhaps we could be looking a bit more of is making sure that when we've got these sows in front of us in lactation, we're making sure that we're minimising her condition loss, matching her diet, so a bit later on in lactation, obviously here, to those of her piglets, and making sure that at weaning she's placed into the correct group for additional feeding if she needs to really start preparing her for her next litter. And really the reason why we're trying to do this, I guess, is to make sure that for her next litter we're optimising birth weights so that we're not always in catch up and trying to manage these small piglets a little bit later on. So I suppose, you know, one of the discussions is, you know, whether as an industry there's more that we can do to make sure that her feeding in late lactation is being matched to those of her piglets, that she is in the right group at weaning, that extra feed is actually happening in that post-weaning period, and that we can make sure that that condition that condition gain is gained as quickly as possible. And of course, we know that about 50% of the birth weight of a piglet is put on in the last 2 weeks of gestation, from about day 85 here onwards. But the proviso of this is that the sow has put on condition before this time point. So there's a huge opportunity, I think, here to be able to target nutrition so that we can optimise these birth weights of piglets, as long as we can make sure that condition is gained a little bit earlier on in the cycle, so that we can make the most of it here. Because I think, you know, there's no real point in body condition sows in late gestation if there's not an awful lot that we can do about it in terms of targeted nutrition, and if it's a little bit too late. So the question is, can we try better splitting these sows at weaning so that we're not trying to put this condition on later? Is there more that we can do actually in the farrowing crate to get her condition on? And is there more targeted nutrition we can do from day 85 to really make the most of that birth weight opportunities? And then improving the colostrum can come a little bit later on. So what about colostrum quality and availability for uptake by piglets? So if the condition's been put on a little bit earlier and we've taken advantage of that increased focus of nutrition from day 85 in gestation onwards, I suppose the question is whether we have the capability of feeding a transition diet to really help to mobilise the additional energy that the sow needs to try and shorten that farrowing duration and metabolise calcium for milk intake and reduce the chance of constipation by providing those additional functional fibres. So the transition feeding really provides a few key roles here. Reduces that farrowing duration so that all of the piglets have got a little bit more of an opportunity to get the colostrum in before the gut closes. We're talking about fibre to reduce constipation, and we're also talking about really trying to mobilise milk production to make sure that those piglets get as much as they need as early as possible. And of course, it's not always practical to feed a transition diet. It requires feeding those sows on a different diet for 7 days when they come into the farrowing house. But we do have a few people feeding these diets now, including a couple outdoors. Not always completely practical, but I suppose a question to us as an industry is, you know, are there ways in which this can be done? Does it provide the benefit to the animals? And is there more that we can do as a nutritional company, for example, by putting the feed in different coloured bags to just make it a little bit more easy to handle at a farm level? So we've spoken about colostrum, and now we're talking about reducing harmful bacteria. And I think a lot of us are aware of the benefits of organic acids to support the gut. But this slide is just to show that different acids target different bacteria, yeasts and molds in the body. And what this is showing is the different acids at the top here, what they're effective against, and then the effect in the body. So for example, your benzoic acids are effective against your bacteria, yeasts and molds, whereas your lactic acids, for example, are predominantly effective against your bacteria. And where your benzoic acid will be acting within the latter parts of the digestive system, we're seeing that the lactic acid is effective in the earlier digestive tract. So this is just a point, I suppose, about making sure that the acids that you're using, whether that be in your feed or in your water, are matched not only to the classification of bacteria, yeast or molds that you're trying to target, but also making sure that it's appropriate for the right age of the animal, and it's in the area in which you want to get the desired effect. And I believe that Nigel will be given another webinar at another stage to talk about how you apply acids in the water to really complement those in the feed to get the effect that you're looking for. So look out for that sometime soon. And then lastly, developing the gut barrier. So as I mentioned earlier, of course, the young animal needs dry matter intake to really help develop that gut barrier. So we're not only talking about making sure that we've got nice tight junctions and we've got a nice barrier against microorganisms coming in, but we're also talking about stimulating the whole digestive system so that we get an absorption of nutrients and your enzyme activity as well. And the main way in which we can really get that gut barrier developed is by stimulating early intake of piglets. And what we're talking about here is consistent and early intake, and making sure that we're not getting peaks and troughs in availability and uptake of feed by the animals. We're making sure that it's gradual, that the feed is kind to the gut, and we're conditioning that early and consistently. Now, what we're seeing here is the time between weaning and first feed intake of pigs for 3 groups. One in red here, which are pigs that ate prior to weaning, and blue of pigs that did not eat prior to weaning. So you can see here that pigs that didn't eat basically took up to 4 times as long to actually eat after they were weaned, which of course has a real negative impact when we're thinking of, you know, keeping those piglets full of energy and making sure that that digestive system is developed as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. And I think we all know the main rules to stimulating early feed intake. We're talking about starting it early, from about 3 days of age, starting with a very small amount at a time, early, little and often. Ideally when the sow is eating, and a time when the rest of the pen is fairly active and moving around. There's quite a lot of research now to show that it's pretty effective to put the crete as far to the head of the sow as possible whilst keeping it hygienically, which wouldn't apply in this case because of the heat lamp, but in other systems it might be a bit more feasible. We know that pigs pigs eat more when they can see other pen mates or mum eating. So if we can take advantage of that, it will be helpful. We do have a couple of customers feeding a porridge type diet, which can dramatically increase the amount of feed eating pre-weaning. But what we would recommend with that is to make sure that you can do it hygienically, and you can do it at least twice a day to really get those benefits that you're looking for. So, you know, as an industry, is this something that perhaps we need to be looking more at? It'd be interesting to hear your comments on that. What we also recommend as well is to make sure that the same diet is fed 5 days before and 5 days after weaning, to make sure that that weaning process is as gradual as possible without too many stresses all happening at once. That we're matching that density of diet, of course, to the pig and its environment that it's going into, and that we're providing plenty of water in different formats to make sure that that's not limiting feed intake. I suppose another challenge to us as an industry is whether we could benefit a bit more from putting specialist weaner accommodation in pig units. This is an example of a customer that just streams the bottom 10% of pigs and places them in a specialist weaning accommodation with porridge, extra warmth and extra TLC to make sure that they are, definitely eating as much as possible, and their systems are really developed and functioning as they should be. I suppose the question is which pigs are not eating prior to weaning, and which pigs would you stream in specialist weaning accommodation if you had the chance? So that's maybe one to mull over. So just the final discussion points, I suppose, for the Q&A sessions, is how can we reduce restrictions to feed intake? How can we better match diets to expected feed intake of animals? Is there anything more that we can be doing to optimise birth weights and colostrum availability and quality, so we can make sure that those pigs get the immunity that they need to start with? Are things like transition diets a bit more feasible? Do we need them a bit more than perhaps once we did? Is the blend of acid in the system conducive to what you want to achieve? And like I said, Nigel will be covering the water side of that a little bit later on, so that conversation is ongoing. And lastly, is feed intake pre-weaning sufficiently high and consistent? Is there more that we need to be doing there? Do we need to look at frequency? Do we need to be looking at things like porridge? It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. And lastly, are you challenging your nutritionist and feed company to complement your hard work by making sure that everything that goes in the feed as well is supporting the gut and making sure that all of your good work is going farther. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Miriam, and Mandy will be giving us a few more areas of thought.
Thanks, Charlotte. That was great. Definitely food for thought there. If anyone's got any questions for Charlotte, if you would like to type them in the question box on your screen, then we'll come to those at the end of the webinar. So we'll now hear from Mandy. Mandy's going to be talking to us about why recording antibiotic use is important and some of the opportunities and challenges that we'll be facing over the coming months. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Mandy.
Okay, hello everybody, and thank you for taking time this evening to join in our webinar. I'm going to talk about optimising antibiotic use on farm and some of the challenges and opportunities that are just around the corner. I'm going to start out by outlining why antibiotic or antimicrobial resistance is our problem, and it is all of our problem. Talk a little bit about what we mean by optimal antibiotic use, and then talk some things about how we make changes and some of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. To begin with, why is antimicrobial resistance all of our problem? Well, antibiotic resistance has been around for a long time. It's not a new phenomenon. Antibiotic resistant bacteria have been found in the guts of ancient mummies from thousands of years ago. And so wherever we use antibiotics, we know that we are going to get antibiotic resistance. When antibiotics were first developed in the 30s and 40s, they were seen as somewhat of a miracle cure. And there would be adverts out there saying, penicillin, all your worries have been solved. Now you can go out and do what you like because we've got antibiotics. But we know that where there's a miracle, it doesn't often last, and antibiotics really are becoming increasingly limited. And we're all aware of the threat that antimicrobial or antibiotic resistance has to our animals and to our human population. Now, I said that antibiotics, where we use them, will drive antibiotic resistance. But what we know is that where you get antibiotic resistant bacteria in, for example, pigs, it tends to stick within that species. The resistant bacteria don't readily jump species, and vice versa. If you get antibiotic resistant bacteria in humans, they don't readily jump to animals. But when they do, they really hit the headlines. And this is a case of Colostrum resistance in pigs being found in the human population, and this caused mass panic and pigs tending to get very bad publicity and being blamed for all the antimicrobial resistance that there is around the world, and that's not true. But we are, as an industry, relatively high users of antibiotics, and we know that that does drive it. So it's incumbent on us all to try and use antibiotics responsibly so that we don't get blamed or tarnished with the brush that we are the causes of antibiotic resistance in man. And I think it's quite important to look at what O'Neill said in his report, and he said that by 2050 there would be more than 10 million deaths on a worldwide scale attributable to antibiotic resistant bacteria, and that will overtake the number of deaths from cancer by 2050. So it is important that we address this, and I think we have taken it very seriously in the pig industry, and we've made some great strides in reducing our use. But it's not just about reducing use, it's about keeping it responsible too. And I prefer to use the term optimal use. What do I mean by optimal use? Well, that's as little as possible, but as much as necessary. And I believe that antibiotics are necessary. They're important for animal welfare, and what's more, they're vital for today's production systems. I tend to think of pigs that we rear as school children. So we've got lots of immunologically naive animals in a confined space. So they're all in close contact with each other, just a bit like a classroom. Very few adult animals. Our sows would be equivalent of teachers. And wherever you get that situation, you do tend to find that coughs and sneezes and splutters spread quite rapidly amongst those group because they've not seen those pathogens before, they've not got developed immune systems, and they will succumb. And I think in that situation, antibiotics are a vital tool in helping us control disease. And I don't think we should be scared of using them. But how do we optimize their use? I think the first thing that we've learned from the pig industry is that you have to measure what you're using. And, you know, if you don't look, you don't see. So it's all very well filling in your EMB, but actually taking the time to look at what you're actually using is the only way that you're going to make any changes. And I think that must have been happening in the pig industry because we have cut our use by over 50% in the last couple of years. And we haven't had any legislation to stop us using antibiotics or anything like that. We have had vets talking about responsible use and raising awareness of it. But for me, the biggest thing that we've done is we've actually measured what we've been using. And just by raising awareness of how much we're using, people have found ways of cutting it out. But I think before we cut further, we need to understand why we're using certain products. And a word of caution really is that we shouldn't stop without good justification and thought, because by just removing antibiotics to get to a target, I think you could do more harm than good. And my advice here is if you're thinking that you're using too many antibiotics, have a good frank discussion with your vet and don't stop without your vet's consent, because I think you could end up with a bit of a problem there. I do think it's right, as Charlotte said in her talk, to challenge people. We can all do with challenging from time to time, even if we don't like it, but I think that's the only way that we do create change. So do challenge things that you're doing on your farm and really reflect on what you're doing, but don't stop without good justification. As I said, our industry has dramatically lowered its use, and it might not be appropriate for your unit to reduce any lower. Regularly review what you're doing, and as I've said, use your vet. Sometimes by challenging yourself, it's not changing things, it's really just looking at how you view what you're doing. And the diagram here I've taken from the internet, and it's a picture that was taken from, I think, an aerospace from, not from space, but from quite high up from the world surface, and it's over the desert. And I think if you look at this image, most of you will see this as kind of pits within the surface, but actually it's not. These are actually sand dunes. And if I turn it round a couple of times, you'll see that those pits tend to stand out. And the reason they do that is because the sunlight is being directed in a way. So when it stops, it probably goes back to looking like pits. And I think it's exactly the same image, but it's just throwing the light from a different angle, and it can make you really see things in a different way. Challenge yourself. And I think the other thing I would say is take time. You need to measure your use and take time to analyze it and discuss it and reflect upon it, because only when you take time can you see the real impact that you can have. Because looking at what you're using is so important, on the EMB we've initiated a benchmarking tool for all producers. The benchmarking is categorized by production type. So if you're a breeder finisher or a nursery unit, you'll be benchmarked against production types similar to your own. And you'll see here that the purple box has your usage. So this is your usage on your farm and the average for the category. And what you'll see on all the different production types is that the graph is actually skewed to the left. So most producers are in this lower region, but there is quite a long tail. And if you're one of these people in this long tail, you might have absolute reason for being there, but it is worth just looking at that and comparing yourself. Is there anything that you can do? We've heard about nutritional alternatives to antibiotics, and there are lots of things that are around, and there will be a number of people coming out with what they consider to be the silver bullet. I don't believe that there is a silver bullet, and it will take a lot of different things to replace what were a great tool in antibiotics. Now, I love this quote by Henry Ford, which is that if he had asked people what they wanted when they were in the pre-car era, they would have said faster horses. And so by looking for something completely different and changing the way we look at things, he created the motor car. And I think that challenge really is up to us. We need to look for alternatives that are as radically different as Henry Ford did when he developed the motor car. Going back to some of the challenges that are out there, we know that we need to produce cheap, efficient, safe pork, and at the same time have really high welfare standards. There's going to be increasing consumer and retailer pressure. And I think really importantly is balancing the ethical issue, is how we position ourselves in treating pigs to control or to eradicate disease versus the pressure to continue to reduce use of antibiotics. For me, the ethical issue is quite easy. I swore an oath when I qualified as a vet to safeguard the welfare of animals committed to my care. And I firmly believe that. I think while we have a tool, as in antibiotics, to help treat pigs and improve their welfare, we should use it. And the call for zero antibiotics in certain production systems, I believe, is completely unethical. Now, the retailers we know have said that things will be non-competitive with regard to antibiotic use, but we are already seeing some retailers producing figures for their antibiotic use in what they say are their supply chains. But I'm quite dubious about this because a lot of them are not using the whole supply chain. They're cherry picking some of their best producers and putting up these figures, and you can't really compare one retailer with another. So we're working hard with retailers at the moment to come up with a solution where we can put figures out there, but that they can be compared, because I think this is quite confusing for consumers to have different recording systems used. So we are, as an industry, all working together to address that. The opportunities, and I think they keep changing, so you need to keep reviewing them. It's up to us all to make sure that we're using antibiotics responsibly. And I would urge you to speak to your vet, see if there are any alternatives. And don't be scared of reviewing your diagnoses on farm. If your vet's come up with a diagnosis, a year or so ago, and you've been treating, been making management changes, and they come on the farm and they say, actually, I think it's time we looked at this. Maybe we need to see whether the disease has changed. And they do change. That's what makes my job really interesting, because I've been in infectious diseases for decades, and the way that diseases change is really interesting. They do change. They're really clever organisms, these bacteria, and what you've got on your farm today will not be the same that you've got on in next month or 6 months or next year. And don't be scared of going down the route of reviewing that and taking samples to make sure that what you're doing is responsible. There are alternatives and supplementary treatments, and I think we're going to see lots and lots of these in the future. Some of them will work, some of them won't work. I think the important thing is that we get the basics right. Now, when Nigel gave his presentation at some of these workshops, he talked about water quality, and I think that is so vital. Just getting the flow rate and the cleanliness of the water, it is basic, but it is done so poorly on the majority of units. So make sure you're not one of those. Make sure you do get the basics right. And then all the things that you know about, that you've known for donkey's years: stocking density, environment management, and nutrition, as Charlotte said, and water. Make sure that your vaccination policy is up to date, and that where you can use vaccinations. And there's been quite a lot of talk in the industry about alternative medicine, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, so things like aspirin that can be used to help with conditions such as lameness, might actually cause the animals to feel better and start eating quicker, and thereby negating the use for prolonged courses of antibiotics. So don't be scared of some of these things, but do make sure that you're using your vet to the utmost of your ability to use them as much as you can. Vaccinations, I think, are seen by some as a silver bullet, but they're not. Vaccinations, they're not often a cheap option. They're never 100% effective, and it's really difficult to get the correct dose to the correct animal at the correct time by the correct route. And I do think that if you can do this well on an ongoing basis, you're a good stock person. But that's what you should be aiming at. But accept that it's difficult. Accept if your staff on your farm are doing this, make sure you give them praise for doing it well, because it's not an easy job to get right. And there will be new diagnostics. There's a lot of talk about pen-side testing, and I think these will come online in the future. We don't have very many of them at the moment, but I'm really excited about some of the ones that are being developed at the moment. So keep an eye out for them, and don't be scared of trying new things. Again, just want to reiterate that none of them are going to be a silver bullet. It's more like lead shot, where each one of these little bullets could be nutrition or vaccines or non-steroidals or management, environment, nutrition, and so on. It's going to be a much more piecemeal approach to replacing antibiotics. If we go back to Henry Ford and his motor car, when he first developed it, people thought this was, really great invention, and it was a great invention at the time, and it revolutionized transport. But who would have thought that we would have come this far in 100 years? And I think that's really exciting opportunity for us in the pig industry. I think we're back at the Henry Ford kind of start of the motor car, and I think with all the developments that are coming down, we're going to have a top F1 model of pig production in the future. Just to conclude then, we need to preserve we need to use antibiotics, but we do need to preserve them for human and animals, and we can only do this through responsible or optimal use. We need to get the basics right. seek advice, find out what's right for you. Do look for alternative strategies, and I'd urge you all to keep an informed and open mind and keep reviewing as new things come to light. Don't be scared of trying things, but do it in a controlled way with input from your vet. And in the meantime, get the basics right, and don't be scared of treating with antibiotics if you need to. You need to help preserve animal welfare. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mandy. That was really good. I think they were both really interesting presentations from both Charlotte and Mandy this evening. Hopefully it's sort of got you all thinking. If you do have any questions that you'd like to pose to either of the speakers tonight, please do type them into the question box on your screens. And in the meantime, just while you're typing or thinking away, I'd just like to remind you that tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be available to watch back on the AHDB Pork YouTube channel in a few days' time. So if there's anything that you want to go back over or share with your friends or colleagues, you'll be able to do that. So on to the questions. Lucia's going to field those for us this evening. I think there's a couple that have come through, so I'll hand over to her.
Charlotte, do you want to go first?
Oh, sorry, Lucia. I only caught the last bit of that question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, it was, how do you think?
I can't hear anything. I don't know if anybody else can.
Hi, it's Mandy. Charlotte, I think if I start with this, the question was, how will zinc removal impact antibiotic use, basically?
Okay.
And
I'm back.
you're back, are you? Do you want to answer that, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to start. Yeah, I mean, obviously the zinc oxide has been used to prevent post-weaning diarrhea on quite a few different units. I think it obviously depends on what's going on in that particular unit as to what impact that removal is likely to have. Of course, if you've already got underlying health status issues, you know, it's possibly going to cause more of an impact removing that than units that don't have these underlying issues. But also, what other strategies have been put in place by yourselves, your vets, and everybody else who has a common interest in that unit. So I think it will differ, but I don't think the picture is all necessarily bad. We know, for example, that zinc oxide is quite bitter to an animal, and certainly we've seen it on a couple of units where the removal of zinc, providing they don't have underlying issues, has actually led to an increase in feed intake, which has been positive on that unit through a better FCR a bit later on. But of course, if that's going to happen, you know, it's a case of making sure that you review the density of that diet to make sure that it is matching those new levels of feed intake. So it's a word of warning there, I suppose, as well. But I don't think it's all necessarily bad for everyone. But I think we all probably need to work together to make sure that it works for everybody. Well, to minimise the losses, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, Charlotte. Thank you. It's Mandy here. From my perspective, I don't know what's going to happen with zinc. I suspect we will get a slight increase in antibiotic use. But what I would like to say is that we're in quite a good position to monitor that and see what actually does happen with the industry. If it does go up, then we will have an explanation for it, because we are tracking antibiotic use on a monthly scale. So it'll be very easy to pinpoint when the zinc oxide ban comes in and what impact it's having. Well, I think the quarterly veterinary review for those in the red tractor is an ideal opportunity to do that. And I think it's important that where you can, download your benchmarking or print it out, have a really good discussion with your vet, make sure that they've got access to it before they come on the quarterly review. And yeah, I think quarterly is an ideal opportunity to do that.
I'm sorry, Lucia, I'm struggling to hear you again.
So, Charlotte, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
The question was, how frequently should you review nutritional regimes, vaccination and antibiotic use? I don't know if you heard my answer, but I suggested the quarterly veterinary review was an ideal opportunity for that.
Yeah, I think so. There'll be some things that perhaps you can do a yearly proper big review as a group, if you like, and then your smaller, more regular updates on a quarterly basis.
Okay, thank you. I've just taken the questions over from Lucia, because I'm guessing, Charlotte, if you're having trouble hearing, some of the attendees might be as well.
Okay.
So there's another question for you, Charlotte. What new products are on the horizon regarding nutrition to help with antibiotic use and resistance?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, you know, there's quite a few different techniques and products out there that probably, you know, we've been aware of for quite a long time, but we've not actually had to implement them so far. So just thinking, for example, about some of the coarse grinding now that you know we do to, you know, for gut health purposes and to reduce stomach ulcers, for example. That's something that has probably been known about for a while, but there's now more and more of a need to bring some of these things into action. So there's things like particle size. There's obviously things like your essential oils, your pre and probiotics, you know, your appetite stimulants, all those types of things. I think, you know, they've been around that, and we'll probably be using more and more of. But I think, you know, there's some alternatives that can show potential, but we've got to be careful that we're actually reviewing the literature properly, that they're also, you know, they are likely to have an impact, and they are going to actually give a return on investment that's feasible for the producer as well. So it's weighing all of those things up as a group. I think probably as an industry, one of the potentials that possibly we haven't looked at as much as we perhaps could have or will do is perhaps fermentation as an industry. That's maybe something else that's going to be coming online that we need to have a look at. But I think, you know, in general, looking at the tools that we already have, you know, making sure the intakes are suited, bearing in mind things like your amino acids are going to be, you're going to need the requirements for some of those essential amino acids are going to be different in challenged versus unchallenged animals. Those types of things probably going to give us you know, a real good start in the short term, with the more sophisticated things coming on a little bit later on down the track.
Okay, thank you. Just while I'm going to respond to that in a minute, Charlotte, but if anybody on the line does have any further questions, please do type them in now, because I think we're going to draw this to a close shortly. So that's your last opportunity. I think really, from my perspective, Charlotte, I agree with everything you say, but just a word of caution that anybody that tries to convince you that they have the solution to all your problems, I think is probably not telling the truth, and just be a bit cautious. But do stay open-minded to it, because there will be new advances coming online, and some of them will work, some of them won't. And I would also encourage you to share your experiences with your peers. So if you're in producer groups, things like that, don't be scared of coming forward and outlining what's worked and what hasn't, because we need to work together as an industry to make sure that we're not compromising anything for our pigs. I've now got a question come in online. Thank you. How does the UK compare to global antibiotic use? Well, I think that's probably aimed at me. Well, it's really difficult actually, because most countries don't measure antibiotic use in the same way. In Europe, we have a standard calculation that we adhere to. So most of the European countries will measure antibiotic usage in the same way, or they'll use the same calculation to do that. And probably 5 years ago, we were in the top third in Europe. I would say now we're in the bottom third. We've made real progress on that. Countries like America, Canada are still an awful lot higher than we are. But I think, you know, I think we can be very proud of where we've got to as a pig industry. We, as you know, we've set a target for 2020, which is 99 mg per kg PCU, and that was set as a kind of as a challenging target. But I'm confident that with the progress we've made so far that we will get there. I don't think it's meant as a target for individual producers. I think it is meant as an industry as a whole. What your antibiotic usage target on your own farm is going to be dependent on the type of production system that you are. So, you know, we know that different groups of pigs will use antibiotics in greater or lesser quantities than others. So knowing that and where you sit on your benchmark, I think will be important. And I think we will, a bit like the poultry industry, we will get to a level within the industry quite soon where any further reduction as an industry is probably not in the interests of the welfare of the animals. I think we've got a little way to go, but I think we will get there. And I think that's 7 o'clock.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Mandy. Thanks for fielding those questions as well. So thank you also to everyone who's listened this evening. We've had a good number attending, and hopefully you all found the presentations really interesting and got some answers to some of your questions. So just a bit of a heads up, the second webinar of this series is going to be taking place on the 22nd of January. And we'll be hearing from Nigel Pennington from AHDB and Mark Jagger from BQP. And they're going to be looking at the importance of water quality, water medication, and the practical approach. I'll pop the sign up link in the chat box now, so you can register now if you'd like to, so you get it in your diary. In the meantime, do keep an eye out on the AHDB website for future webinars. Other sectors also run them, so there might be something of interest for you. And of course, a special thank you this evening to Mandy and Charlotte for taking time out of their busy schedules. So again, the recording of this webinar will be available to watch back in a few days, hopefully. And everyone who's registered this evening will get a link sent via the email to let you know when it's available. So thank you once again, and good night to everybody.